Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's event, Building Women's Leadership for a Public Pathway to a Just Energy Transition. My name is Irene Shen, and I work with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, also known as TUED. Interpretation today is provided by Isabel Panaranda from the Colectivo Danta. So if anybody is interested in having great interpretation, please let me know and we can hook you up. So for those of you who are not familiar with TUED, we are a global network of 131 unions from over 40 different countries. Discussions at Rio Plus 20 climate talks in 2012 by Global South trade unions raised the need for an alternative to the dominant market-based approach to addressing the energy transition and climate change. Those Global South unions, along with some Global North unions, met in New York City later that year and decided to launch the TUED network. We, as Sarah mentioned, we're in partnership with the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies, and we're housed in the school. We want to thank the SLU Public Programs team for having us today. So TUED's fact-based research and analysis highlights the failures of neoliberal energy policy, which have been unable to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Instead, global levels of greenhouse gases continue to rise, meaning that climate change is not slowing down. TUED, on the other hand, proposes that the energy sector be publicly owned and democratically controlled, that energy is not a sector in isolation, but it's connected to other critical sectors such as industry, agriculture, transportation, and buildings. And that the question of ownership of energy and subsequently its control is absolutely critical. And it is often ignored in climate discussions. You've heard that you've heard the term public pathway referenced in the title, you've seen it in the description, and it will be referenced today in the discussion. So what is it? I'll break it down a little bit. So TUED upholds that access to energy be recognized as a human right, that energy be demarketized and decommodified, and that the provision of electricity is a public service providing a public good. We call this framework a public pathway. And by pathway, we mean that this is a journey, it's dynamic, it's evolving, and it's a way forward. You can learn more about this in the Trade Union Program for a Public Low Carbon Energy Future that was drafted with a number of unions in the fall of 2021. We'll drop the link into the chat if you're interested in looking into it. Also on our website, there's lots of resources and publications for a deeper dive into the analysis and also the public pathway. In 2022, we launched a platform called TUED South, and we pivoted our work toward Global South unions to focus on issues of the energy transition facing regions of Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia Pacific. And then in 2024, we launched the Women's Leadership Project for a Public Pathway. And over the last year, it's really been a very collective process, holding women's caucuses at each of the regional policy meetings we've had and the interregional meeting earlier this year, and hearing from women in the trade union movement and allies about their experiences as women leaders, but also a sense of their experiences in the energy sector and their thoughts on energy policy. Energy is the backbone of the global economy. Any changes in energy will have a ripple effect on the economy. And because of climate change, we're at a moment when an energy transition is absolutely necessary, and that opens up opportunities to transform the capitalist economy. So for women, feminists, allies who live within and or recognize the exploitation of reproductive labor that underpins the global economy, and let me just share a few statistics here that I got from the Oxfam website, which are relevant. Women are in the lowest paid work. We earn 24% less than men. 700 million fewer women are in paid work compared to men. 75% of women in developing regions are in the informal economy. 600 million are in the most insecure and precarious work. And women do at least 2 to 10 times more unpaid care work as men in housework or childcare, for example, on top of their paid work. And the value of this unpaid work per year is estimated to at least $10.8 trillion, which is more than 3 times the size of the global tech industry. And we have longer work days when paid and unpaid work is counted together. So you're getting a picture. The public pathway is an opportunity to shift those dynamics away from the exploitation of human labor and the destruction of environment, and toward a plan that prioritizes ecological and human need like gender equity. It creates the potential, and of course we'll need to struggle for this, but to center a women's liberation platform in a just energy transition. And with that introduction, let's introduce today's guest speakers. I have here 2 really incredible women who have been on the front lines in many ways. First, Suraya Jawoodeen. Suraya is a union activist from South Africa. She is the former Deputy General Secretary of the National Education, Health, and Allied Workers Union, also known as NAHAWU, and the former head of Secretariat of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, also known as NUMSA. She currently serves as the African coordinator for TUED. And then we have Irene Calvé, who is an expert in power systems, distributed generation, and energy access. She has extensive experience in the electricity sector across Europe, Latin America, and Africa, and has worked both with development finance institutions as well as in the private sector. So welcome to both of you. I'll start with you, Suraya. The energy sector is male-dominated on all levels, and women's contributions are highly marginalized or non-existent sometimes on the central question of how to decarbonize the economy. Part of the fight for a feminist public pathway is to get our voices into those conversations with technical and political knowledge of energy grounded in a public pathway. But we also need to articulate the sexism and male domination in our own workplaces so that we know what challenges need addressing under a public pathway framing. So you, Suraya, have worked with progressive unions, which have supported the public ownership of energy. Some unions have had more of a gender balance, others a majority male, were male unions. So can you tell us a bit about your experience as a woman leader in the South African trade union movement?
All right, thanks. So I think that just take a step back. Trade unions come out of a shop floor. They come together in solidarity as workers around their working conditions. And that workplace and shop floor has changed quite considerably through globalization, through neoliberal economic policies. Entire production units can be moved to another part of the world, which has weakened the trade union movement, the labor movement across the world. Working conditions have become more precarious, and most women are located in that precarious strata. But many men in the labor movement are on a defensive mode of operating, barely managing wage increases, fighting to stop restructuring of the workplace. Capital is reproducing itself differently. It doesn't need the production line for its accumulation regime. And since 2008, we've seen quite a serious economic crisis. And when that happens, gender inequality and socioeconomic inequality increases. Now, the trade union movement, like all other institutions in a capitalist system, reflects the values of that capitalist society. The fact that they're more progressive politically around working class struggles does not necessarily immediately translate to a progressive approach to what is the role of women. So most men occupy leadership positions in South Africa. Many unions have gender quotas for leadership, but women are few and far between and occupy very specific kind of positions around being treasurers and other things. Now, I think that the consciousness around where women fit into the labor movement is not automatic. It's as a product of our patriarchal system, capitalist system, that reproduces itself on the basis of cheap labor, and women support men that go out to work, go out themselves, and take on a whole lot of unrecognized work, housework, domestic work. And so the labor movement reproduces itself around conditions of employment, wage increases, but not necessarily on a genderized or feminist ticket. So wage negotiations would be about salary increases, but not about childcare. Negotiations would be about health and safety, but sexual harassment doesn't form part of occupational health and safety. Yet many women workers experience sexual harassment in sectors like energy, mining, steel, which form a big part of development and industrialization in the society. So I think that the labor movement mirrors the values of the capitalist system. The working class struggles on the shop floor take priority. And in South African context, it's a racialized class struggle. So the gender issue is a struggle we come to later. And that gets mirrored in how the labor movement is organized. Yeah, let me just pause there.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, that's a great context for which you're framing the struggles that women experience actually being part of the labor movement. Is there anything you would like to share about your own experiences having been a labor leader in the movement and continue to be an activist in the labor space?
Yeah, so I think that the labor movement is experiencing various difficulties. As I said, it has become largely bureaucratized. I mean, so I think that what I would have experienced is no different from what other women leaders have experienced. The labor movement's history is largely written as a history of male leaders. And yet, in the South African context, which is the context I'm more familiar with, several women were part of forming the labor movement. Several women fought the apartheid system, which led them into community struggles, the labor movement struggles, but very little's written about them. We find ourselves forming part of what becomes the dominant culture in the union, which is a male-led culture. There are some comrades, progressive, and could be called feminist, but they're few and far between. And the issue for me is that it's not shocking or surprising, because to get a feminist organization, you need to do quite deep political, theoretical, ideological work to raise consciousness of what does it mean that when you leave work, you go home, but your uniform is washed, your children's needs are taken care of, their school uniforms are washed, the food is cooked, and so you can get up and go back to work the next morning. And it's those tasks that policy doesn't take into account, that unions don't take into account. And women leaders are not quite sure how to respond to this thing we call reproductive labor, the care work, the unpaid work, the housework. And so that determines how many meetings you can attend after hours. In the South African context, public transport after hours is dangerous. And so if women don't pitch to meetings and childcare is not taken care of, the hour in which the meeting is called is not taken care of, it's unlikely they can pitch to be available to occupy leadership at the levels in which they should be occupying that. And if those arrangements for childcare timing of meeting, transportation is not taken into account, women then end up not being available at the point at which leadership is contested. And so the quotas are important, but if they, in terms of how many women must occupy leadership, but if that doesn't change the practice of what the union defends on the shop floor, what it defends within the union itself, it's not unusual for, and I think this is an international thing, for male leaders to not recognize that when they flirt with a staff member who's younger, when they flirt with a female shop steward, there's a power dynamic to it. There's a power relationship that they don't see that as harassment. And often women leaders and women workers don't know how to respond. And that then also gets translated to what do you defend on the shop floor? What becomes your priority? So in a very complicated climate, with climate challenges, with energy poverty, I mean, the discussion on decarbonization is taking place in countries where large parts of women population in rural areas, in our context, Black women, have not had access to energy. And yet there are the working class is being expected to deal with climate change. What is the transition and how do you decarbonize? But many haven't even had access to that energy. So how the unions prioritize these policy discussions is often a reflection of what does it mean to be a union leader. It's difficult when you, in a leadership collective, have to remind comrades, I got elected in the same Congress as you. I don't attend the meetings to make your tea. And so that's just like an simplistic, crude example. But when socioeconomic and gender inequalities deepen in an economic crisis, the working class often turns inward and turns on itself. So they blame someone, they blame women, they blame migrants, and the levels of violence against women and levels of sexual harassment in organizations like trade unions in the workplace deepen. We live in a world where the trade unions don't operate in isolation from the challenges of where sexual violence against women is considered a weapon in a war. We live in a period of where genocides are taking place and women are the target. They're humiliated to show a nation that we've dealt with you, we've colonized you. And so those values translate in all institutions, including the labor movement, despite its very progressive rhetoric on class struggles, but they're not necessarily the same politics on what is the gender struggle.
Great, thank you, Suraya, for that. I think we will speak later to this idea of, the need to address the political and ideological work, and that, we can take a look at what the public pathway might provide in terms of opportunities to do that kind of work potentially and address some of these deeper seated struggles that women face in their workplace, in the trade union movement, and all over. So thanks, Suraya. I'm going to turn to Irene now. And we're going to shift from sort of women as workers to women as consumers of energy. So Irene, you have had extensive experience in multiple regions of the world on energy access issues. And there's energy poverty in many regions of the world, but sub-Saharan Africa holds the highest concentration, with over 600 million people without access to electricity today in 2025. Meanwhile, there have been years of policy initiatives from the World Bank and other development financing institutions to move energy policy away from strengthening public energy utilities and instead in the direction of privatizing energy, particularly electricity generation, but that these efforts have not reduced energy poverty, by any significant means. So can you explain to the audience why these policies continue to fail despite the many attempts?
Sure. So can you hear me well?
You sound great.
Perfect. So hi everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. So why do they fail? I think the answer is quite complex on the sense that this is like following a mantra. We need, so electrification costs money. The states cannot afford right now the money that all the poles, the cables, the panels will cost. So we need to attract private sector in order to manage that everyone has access to electricity. Except that the last bit, access to electricity, and not only access to electricity, because I think it's important to make a difference between access to electricity and electricity for development. So let me complete or elaborate on that. Let's imagine a village in which you might have access to, for electricity, to have one TV in the village and a couple of light bulbs. Is that really allowing for development? Because I don't think so. Electricity that allows for development is electricity that has a competitive price, allowing industrial production, but also electrifying institutions, health centers, especially for women, for example, because I don't think it's really fun to give birth in complete dark. So that's the important part. And my point here is that private sector is installing PV panels, private sector is doing things, but the electricity that is generated doesn't allow for development, and the amount of people and the growth of the population is higher than the level of electrification. So at some point, I mean, as a sector, forgot completely about the second part, like what we want to achieve is development, right? And we just went to, okay, we need to enable the everything for the private sector. And then as a result, all the policies are based on de-risking to attract private sector and make sure there's someone installing PV panels and other generation or transmission or distribution. But this is not working. First of all, for three reasons. First of all, private sector is not interested unless the level of risk is reduced way more than today is possible. Second point, the returns expected by private sector cannot be covered. They just simply can't. I mean, it is not possible. Electricity has never, as a whole, has never been profitable. It is profitable for states because, for example, if you have electricity, you can have preventive medicine, and then you don't need to cure people. So it's going to be less expensive for the state. But in the case of pure private approach, then of course you don't see those benefits. So it will never be profitable. And that is the point in which the sector is blocked. And there's no recognition of this is not working. It's just a question of de-risking more. And I think even letting aside whatever we can think about private, public, okay, let's imagine I fully support a full privatization of everything. It is not working, and that's data. So can we start taking this seriously and for once analyze what has been done historically? Because there's no country on earth that has electrified itself without huge public amounts of money. So how would you expect this to happen in one of the places where people are the most poor on earth? It just doesn't make sense. And on the top of that, someone will justify saying, yes, but they are new technologies, which is a fair point. But even with new technologies, with distributed, with whatever, with solar decreasing cost, yes, of course, it can be cheaper, but still is not cheap enough, not at all, nowhere close to make the whole electricity value chain as a single profitable activity.
Thanks for that. And when you say that it's not cheap enough, part of that problem is because you still, under a private system, you still have to pay the profit margins for the private investors in addition to just the delivery of electricity. Is that correct?
That's totally correct. You need to pay the profit margins, the cost of capital, which obviously the cost of capital is based on certain parameters like the country risk, like the activity risk, like the person who is paying you or the entity who is paying you kind of risk. Given the situation, which is usually in countries that have no good rating, with either the state paying you, either directly the citizens, and with new technologies like distributed, of course, the profit expected is really high. So it's just complicating it more.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And can you actually talk specifically I think you referenced it early on when you were talking about the difference between access and turning on a light bulb versus development. But can you talk a little bit about the impact of energy poverty on women in particular?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I can narrate what I saw, just because I'm still a Spanish person living in Spain, etc. But I have spent a lot of time in rural zones of different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what you see is, for me, the most staggering is birth giving. You have to give birth on the dark without any kind of potential medicine or whatever. Can you just imagine that, the level of fear? Using what I saw that the light of a phone, that's all the light you will get. The walking for hours and hours just to get water, because that's also on the women's back. The agriculture, everything related to irrigation, there's no irrigation. So all the plants, all the taking care, there's no machinery. So that's on you. Cooking, you could go to electrical cooking maybe, but right now it's cooking with charcoal in the best of the cases, producing a lot of diseases related to breathing, etc., because of the smoke. It is so many things. And then there's the education of the kids that, of course, also is on the woman. I have seen villages in which you need to, I mean, they are not accessible for the rainy season. So the teachers do not want to live in the village because they have no electricity. So they live outside the village, like near a city or near a place that has electricity, and commute every day, except that for the whole period of the rainy season, which with climate change is more and more unpredictable, and on the top of that, it's longer, then they cannot access the village. So during that period, there's just no class, for example. Because sometimes I have heard the argument that primary school don't need electricity, which could be a fair point because most of the time is during daylight. But still, the teachers are not going to be there. And that again is on the shoulder of women. So electricity is such an important component for women. And also, let's not forget about the industrial activity. If you as a woman want a minimum of emancipation, you have to be able to have your own money. How can you do a new business? How can you start producing if you have no electricity? Those are additional difficulties that makes it even more complicated. So that's the reality and the absolute need of access for electricity, which is, by the way, not going to solve the whole problem. If you are free for going to find water, don't worry, you will find another task that you are doing for free as a woman, even with electricity. But I mean, I think it's the minimum basis for decent human life.
Yeah, well said. I know in particular you have a lot of experience with distributed generation, and you may have touched on it briefly, but can you explain to our listeners who may not know what is distributed generation and how it relates to energy access, particularly in this period of policy? And yeah, sort of how does it serve, or how is it supposed to serve as a tool of development?
Yes, of course. So distributed electricity in the case of energy access in sub-Saharan Africa usually refers to two things. Solar home system, which is basically installing a very small PV panel, either on the floor or the roof, or you move it as you want, and some internal wiring on DC that you yourself with nails can put on your home. And that PV panel, which is really small again, it's usually connected to a very small battery. And that can provide you with a basic kit, which is 2 light bulbs and maybe some phone charging. In the best of the cases, you can even have some, how do you call it, some radio. But that's basically what you can access with a solar home system. Some might argue that there are more powerful solar home systems, which is true, but they are more expensive and no one can access them, at least not in rural areas, maybe in peri-urban. The second option is what is called a mini grid, which is basically in a village to install PV panels and batteries on the floor, and then build a network with cables and poles to connect every household. So those are the two options that we have as distributed solutions, and stuff in the middle, but I'm not going to get into that. And why is it important to energy access? Because it's an amazing way of pre-electrifying things. Like, let's imagine that the main grid it is planned to reach a village in the next 10 years, which still it's optimistic. On the meantime, the distributed solutions can be a potential solution. Just doing a mini grid, it will provide access to electricity to the whole village, and that would be great. And it can even be a definitive solution. For example, in Latin America, in some countries where there's in the jungle or in the very high areas, you don't bring in the grid until those places would not make any kind of economical sense. It is better to just to have a mini grid there, and that's it. The problem is not linked to the technology. The problem we are finding is linked again to the way we are installing, the financial way we are installing this technology. So for instance, the example I was giving in the case, I think it's of Colombia, the people that are using a mini grid pay exactly the same that is paid in the main grid. On the contrary, when we go to sub-Saharan Africa, in most of the projects related to either mini grid or solar home system, the user has to pay 100% of the cost. There's a partial subsidy of the material, so the PV panels, the batteries, that is provided by a DFI, but still the price we can find for electricity compared to the price you can find in the city is maybe 10 times more expensive. So of course, if we do that, again, we go back to the problem stated before. People can only use electricity for very, very basic things, light bulb, etc., which is, by the way, what they are already paying for torches. They pay it now for a light bulb. But is that development? And that is my point. Is that development? Because development comes from the electrification of the means of production. So the electrification, the automatization, the level of development of the means of production. So the problem here is that if you have a very high price of electricity and you need to use electricity to produce something, how are you going to be competitive with the rest of the world? Everything provided as a produced with a cheaper electricity price is going to be more competitive. So you are deemed to import. And that is key. We all know that electricity price for industrial needs in any country of the global north is one of the most important topics. So we cannot play it dumb and think, oh yeah, but this is the resulting price. Okay, but in that case, I don't think we are talking about electricity for development. We are talking about electricity as a consumption mean, as a luxury good. not a basic good. And that is very important. And that's not the SDG 7, and that is not development. So I think it is very, very important to bring up everything related to industrialization. This is not related to electricity being coming from a mini grid or a solar home system or the main grid. This is related to full private mode with full recuperation of all the costs plus the cost of capital through the tariff. That is not possible. It's just not working, and it's not development.
Great, that's very thorough. Thank you, Irene. Yeah, there's a we have a mountain of challenges ahead. I want to turn now, actually, because of time, but also because both of you have raised a number of really important challenges that women face in general and in the context in particular of energy. And with the public pathway, we have a particular opportunity. It doesn't mean that it's automatic because we support the public ownership of energy at all, but there's a potential for a set of conditions that can be created when you have an energy system which affects, the global economy. When you have a system that is not beholden to profit, but can actually prioritize ecological and human needs. That there's the potential for planning, which is obviously very important in energy transition, but also the possibility of planning other things, social, economic elements of justice, as well as thinking about the rights of nature. All of those things can potentially be thought about within a planned energy transition. And so I want to turn back to you, Suraya, just to think a little bit about, what are the opportunities that we face under a public pathway, given the challenges that you raised that women face? What are some of the, potential elements of infrastructure or mandated public policies that could be possible in public energy utilities, for example, that could address some of the issues that you've raised earlier?
Okay, so I think that we've all find ourselves in a position where we think it's now not possible to undo neoliberal policies that have reduced the role of the state and roll back state responsibility. But I think things have got so bad where we are all required to be making the call for public pathway, for public policies that address human needs, for development that address human needs. A public energy system would be the foundation of such a call. We should be making the call for services as a public good, services that meet needs of all its citizens, in particular working class people, working class women. We can't continue on the trajectory that there isn't another way. The neoliberal system itself is in a crisis. You have a group of billionaires killing themselves over what are the spoils. And the US right now represents that. So there may be opportunities to entangle ourselves from the kinds of trade agreements we've had that have been US dominated in the World Trade Organizations. Those trade tariff agreements could be giving us space to say, in South Africa, for example, our public energy system has been unbundled. And so we almost look at it in despair, and the solution has become public-private partnerships, blended finance, World Bank loans for renewables, for the repurposing of power stations in order to decarbonize at rates and at goals that have been set by the North, which is not possible. But so we look at it and think there aren't alternatives. We have to be, as women, both in the energy sector, women who do not have energy, the working class community, different stratas of society, should be arguing for gender responsive, gender sensitive budgets, gender responsive, gender sensitive policies that take into account that the few women who do work, if they work shifts, must walk in the dark, unreliable transport, and try and get home and expect that they're not going to be assaulted. We do need public energy systems that allow them to walk in light when they have left their shift. We think that we've got to ensure that the working class does not disproportionately have to deal with the solutions of the system we're in. And so if you have public policy around energy, it can lead to public policy on affordable housing that takes into account climate mitigation, climate adaptation, reliable, safe, affordable public transport, access to health. I mean, I think Comrade Irene from Spain has raised the difficulties of healthcare in an environment where there's energy poverty. Those are unsustainable ways in which we can develop and build our economies. It isn't incorrect for the working class and the poor of the South to be arguing for economic justice, for gender justice, because economic justice can't happen without being responsive to the needs of women.
Thank you, Suraya. Yes, and you know, one of the aspects of the public pathway is to think about democratic control. And what does democratic control mean? You know, it has the potential to mean inserting these kinds of public policies that actually serve the needs of women specifically, and can build in infrastructure, not just in individual private energy companies, but across the board as a policy in the sector that responds to the challenges that women face in the current situation, and would potentially address some of these needs from safety, you know, accommodations for care work, et cetera. And so I think we are just at the front end of developing or thinking about putting our heads together collectively to think about some of these issues and what might the possibilities be. What would we actually fight for if we, as we move the needle of a public pathway framework forward, what are the kinds of things we would fight for? And I think you've started to raise some of those things. And I just want to integrate into the conversation this idea of leadership, right? Because what we've experienced over the last years in TUED is that not just women, but across the board, there's a gap in understanding both the technical and the political elements of energy, and to then get to these high-level conversations and to be able to push for the kinds of policies under public ownership of energy, to push for the policy of the public ownership of energy and democratic control, that we need women who understand the more nuanced elements of the energy sector. And so part of the idea of this initiative, of this project, of the Women's Leadership Project, is to have a series of workshops for which the two of you and others in our network would break down some of this information and train women to be basically equipped with understanding these arguments to then engage in these spaces around these discussions on decarbonization and pushing forward a women's platform. And we need those spaces to kind of build women's knowledge base collectively and the leadership to take those messages forward. And that's part of what this initiative is trying to do. We haven't started that series of workshops, and we would like to do them regionally so that, particular issues, even though the energy policies, the trends are very similar, there are particular issues that each region faces that are particular challenges of those regions. So that's some of the ideas behind what we're doing. And in these early stages, we're just beginning the conversations, hearing what trade union women think about these issues, but also starting to share more and more information about how to think about talking about the policy issues and breaking them down for a deeper dive into understanding them. I know we're 10 minutes to the hour. I want to raise one more issue that Irene has raised a bit already, and then see if there's a couple of questions that might be on the floor. So let's see. So just in general, this idea of development under a public pathway, what is possible, right? We've talked about the challenges that without, more economic capacity, without the access to electricity and electricity that can actually deliver the supply needed to build economies to a greater scale, and then potential, industrial development, et cetera. We're kind of at a standstill. But if we were to imagine well-resourced public energy systems, what could we actually achieve? What are some of the possibilities out there? Just throwing that out there for both of you to chime in here.
Maybe I can provide 2 ideas that come to mind. For me, the first one, which is the most important one, is the fact that electricity as itself is never going to be profitable. Electricity is key for a country, for any kind of basic health, basic education. If you have preventive health, you will spend less budget on health. If you have education, you will get more from taxes as a state, etc., etc. So if the electricity is public, then you can factor in the decrease of cost or expenditures in another sector that is not electricity to pay electricity or energy. So I think that part is just mathematics, and it needs to be taken seriously. The second point is on democratic planning. I think there are 3 things over there. First of all, for real, and I know we all know that, but I think it's always important to say so. For real democratic planning, we need a state that answers to the people and not to the capital. So that is already a bit complicated. But given the situation in which we find ourselves, I think public electricity is key for executing a planning, because all the states have a plan for electricity. What are we going to do? But then, if you cannot execute it, how do you plan? You can only go and beg for private sector to do whatever you think is the most important. And begging, we all know what it means. It means to pay subsidy, to increase the cost of capital, etc., etc. So I think it's a matter of autonomy and sovereignty of the countries. And the third point I wanted to make on democratic planning, because that scares me a little bit, and it goes both in the North and in the global South. We are starting to think that electricity planning and democracy is linked to small systems where everyone can give their opinion and what we should do. I'm sorry, but electricity is a complex topic. So what I think we should do is that the same that when we think about health, I have no idea about health sector, no knowledge at all. But as a user, I know basic things. I want to be able to get an appointment as soon as I get sick. I want the doctor to be able to be with me more than 5 minutes. That's what I want as a user. So as users of the electricity, we need to be able to establish what we want. And that's not, I'm not going to a hospital arguing about how many machines should they have. I'm arguing as a user, what service would I want? So I think that, and this is a trap in which we are falling, in which we think democracy means I give my opinion on the machines, on the cables, on the poles, on where should they be installed or not, etc. No, I need to express as a citizen and as a user what are my needs, and then let the planners do their job.
Irene, can I come in for a minute?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So on just to follow up on what the other Irene said, we need to be struggling for a new energy order, a new energy system. It's possible, and it's got to be public electricity for all the reasons Irene has pointed out. The private sector operates for profits. They haven't actually come on board en masse, as was envisaged by the World Bank, in relation to renewables, because they're not profitable enough for them. We need to stop the World Bank loans and trying to meet World Bank imperatives and targets. They're unrealistic, they haven't worked, they're not working. Even the World Bank realizes that. And a new energy order is only possible if the South collaborates, if the South shares technology, if it shares energy, if it works collaboratively against what's become a dominant discourse of the state must do less. The complexities of finances, as Irene raises, we agree. But we can't be intimidated by the voices whenever we say energy must be public, and they say, where must the finances come from? There is developmental finances. It doesn't have to be World Bank interest rates. In South Africa, our government continues with World Bank loans, trying to meet unrealistic targets, and rolls back on service provision in order to service those debts that they have incurred through the World Bank loans. That's not going to develop us, not going to industrialize us. So a new energy order must be fought for. It's possible, and it must be based on public electricity in a collaborative way in the South. And I know I'm misbehaving now because I want to raise something quickly, but I think the comrades won't forgive me if I don't. There are several South African trade unionists who were in an all-day workshop on green industrialization and have joined your meeting in a Zoom link because they think that their program has not had a gender focus. So they made this webinar a compulsory part of their program. And I just wanted to put that on the table. Otherwise, they won't forgive me for not acknowledging their presence. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Suraya. I want to just go to some of the questions, and I think in sort of following up from what you said and then looking at the questions, how would you weave the element of leadership into this? Because I think you've raised some things that we have to fight for, things, looking forward. And in the context of women's leadership, what would you say, what do you think is necessary as we're building women to lead in these spaces? So I'm just throwing that out there. And then I also just want to acknowledge a couple of the questions that are here. What skills for distributed energy can women and communities learn so to be more active as workers for both the hard skills and the policy advocacy organizing work? And then one other question here is, in the energy sector, there are practically no female delegates. We have a job to do to encourage women to occupy strategic positions. Do you have any suggestions to better prepare us? Yeah, so I think both of these are sort of in line of the building of women leadership. So over to the...
Yeah, should I go?
Please.
Yeah. So two answers. First, in terms of what skills are the best. When we're talking about rural areas, etc., for me, the best skills is everything related to installation, operation, and reparation of PV panels, batteries, poles, etc. And depending on the country, there are organizations already doing that, going to rural areas and training. And women have a lot to bring on the table, by the way, because one of the main problems when you are in rural areas and, for example, a male person is trained for electricity reparation or installing or everything, he leaves the village and goes to the city. That happens a lot. Whereas a woman, most of the time, of course, she has to take care about kids, grandkids, all the family and everyone else. So they won't leave the village. So it makes way more sense. And again, there are organizations that are already doing and providing training in rural areas, at least as far as I know, in Benin, in Zambia, in Kenya, in Malawi, so in most of the countries. And the second point on leadership, for me, there's something I will always make a point, because we talk about women empowerment, about women encouragement. Guys, we don't need to be empowered. We don't need to be encouraged. I don't need to be empowered, not at all. I just need to be left alone and be able to do what I know what to do, how to do it, etc. Because every time we talk about encouraging or empowerment, it's like we women, as by default, there's something on us that doesn't allow us to be capable of doing things. No, that's called oppression. It's really easy. When you try to do things and you get systematically smashed, destroy, if you give your opinion in a valid way, an assertive way, then of course you talk too much. If you don't talk, you're stupid. If you talk too much, you are a crazy bitch. I mean, there's no right space for us. And the funniest part is when they say, oh, but I need to empower you. No, I don't need empowerment. I just need to be left alone and be treated as a person. That's everything that we need.
Can I come in for a minute, Irene? Yeah. So I think that women leadership on the issue of energy in particular, not just generally, I think that there are women who are operate under extremely difficult conditions because they don't have access to energy. Energy is unaffordable. They're women who work in the energy sector. So all of these women and different stratas of society have to start raising their voices. We can't be intimidated by the fact we may not understand technical aspects of how many gigawatts is created in this power plant, what is the carbon footprint of this coal mine in relation to energy. But what we do understand is we want a different energy system. We want a state to take responsibility for public policy, public energy systems, and other policies that have a huge impact on women. And trade union women or trade union men and women or working class communities are not going to be able to do this on their own. We're going to have alliances with different parts of society, different organizations, the NGOs, the social movements, middle stratas of the society, to fight for something called energy sovereignty, that our nation states can't be undermined by financial institutions and by the North, who themselves don't comply with the targets around climate change. So I think women leadership can emerge, but we need to unite in ways that cut across organizations. We can bring a general platform together, a united front on a new energy order, on collaboration, and a state taking responsibility for providing services as a public good for its society, but in particular for the working class. And that development is necessary, but can't happen without energy, without women's leadership in relation to how it affects them. And this must be to meet human needs, in particular women's needs in working class communities and rural areas.
Great, thank you both. We are 5 minutes over our time, and so I think we're going to wrap up now. I just want to say that, I mentioned before, our intention is to try and do some workshops so that women can become more fluent in the understanding of the technical and political aspects of energy. And then to, many of you are already engaged in spaces of climate change, climate discussion, energy transition discussions. And so, you know, we believe that fighting for a public pathway is really a feminist approach to the energy transition, and getting more fluent in these, you know, the policy understanding and the politics of the issues of energy, as well as the technical aspects, can help arm us with what we need to be pushing our voices around the issues of energy transition that actually would benefit and center a women's agenda. If you're interested, please feel free to get in touch with us. We will be running these workshops first with trade unions, and then sort of probably opening it more broadly as we develop out the curriculum. But thank you so much to both Suraya and Irene for your time, your thinking, your like wealth of experience. And I hope we can come back and talk some more about this in the near future. All right. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, everybody, for joining and staying extra.
Thank you very much.
Bye.